This story is based on true events. Names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Reynhard Sinaga was, on the surface, the epitome of what many would call a model citizen, a well-educated, polite, and seemingly respectable individual. Born in 1983 in Sumatra, Indonesia, Sinaga came from a wealthy family. His father owned a private bank, and his upbringing was one of privilege and opportunity. As a child, he lived a life of comfort, one far removed from the struggles that most people face. This privileged background allowed him to pursue his education with ease, first graduating from the University of Indonesia with a bachelor's degree in architecture in 2006. His thirst for knowledge seemed boundless, and he would soon make the decision to pursue further studies in the United Kingdom. Sinaga arrived in the UK in 2007, initially settling in Manchester, where he enrolled at the University of Manchester. There, he pursued a master's degree in urban planning, a field that mirrored his academic prowess and ambition. He was not just a student, he was a star in his own right, praised by professors and peers for his diligence and intelligence. Sinaga's academic record was impeccable, and he quickly earned his master's degree in 2009. Yet, his desire for further education was insatiable. He went on to earn another master's degree in sociology in 2011, continuing to demonstrate an almost obsessive commitment to his studies. However, despite his academic success, there was an underlying tension in Sinaga's life, one that few knew about at the time. In 2012, Sinaga began his doctoral studies at the University of Leeds. His pursuit of a PhD seemed like a natural next step for someone so dedicated to his intellectual growth. Yet, despite his outward successes, he struggled. His first doctoral submission was rejected, and the stress of academic failure began to affect him. Still, he pressed on, continuing to live a double life that would remain hidden from view for years. On the outside, he maintained the facade of a diligent student, someone who was committed to his work and respected by his peers. But beneath this image was a darker side, a side that Sinaga carefully kept under wraps, even from those closest to him. While studying in the UK, Sinaga was supported financially by his family, particularly his father, who continued to fund his education and living expenses. This financial safety net allowed Sinaga to live comfortably without needing to work. He rented an apartment near Princes Street in Manchester, a location that would later become infamous as the site of his crimes. The apartment was strategically situated near a vibrant nightlife district, close to bars, clubs, and the Manchester gay village. This area, buzzing with energy and young people, became the hunting ground for Sinaga's sinister activities. Sinaga's sexual orientation was a matter he kept hidden from many people. In Indonesia, where conservative values were strongly ingrained, being openly gay was not an option for someone from a devout Christian family. Sinaga's family was religious, and the expectations placed on him were in line with the cultural norms of their community. His decision to move to the UK seemed to be a turning point in his life, providing him with the freedom to embrace his sexuality in an environment that was more open and accepting. However, rather than finding genuine companionship or building healthy relationships, Sinaga chose to channel his desires into something far darker. He was not just seeking intimacy or connection. Instead, he harbored an urge to dominate, control, and violate others. From the outside, Sinaga appeared as nothing more than a polite, reserved individual, someone who followed the rules and focused on his studies. He had a soft-spoken demeanor, and few would have suspected the horrors he would go on to commit. Sinaga was also deeply involved in the local church, often attending services and participating in community activities. His friends and acquaintances knew him as a compassionate person, who cared for others and was eager to help those in need. It was this juxtaposition between his public persona and his hidden nature that made Sinaga so dangerous. He was a master of deception, able to present himself as a respectable individual while simultaneously harboring violent and depraved desires. Throughout his time in the UK, Sinaga built a network of acquaintances and friends, many of whom knew him only as a diligent student and a kind person. He had a few close friends who knew him as someone who often spoke of his academic achievements and his admiration for Manchester as a city. Sinaga even bragged about his success in living a luxurious lifestyle, flaunting his wealth and education. His apartment, although modest in comparison to his family's wealth, was an extension of his carefully curated image, a place that appeared unremarkable to most, yet it would become the site of unimaginable crimes. By day, Sinaga's life was uneventful. He attended lectures, conducted research, and engaged in academic discussions with his peers. However, when the sun set and the nightlife of Manchester took hold, Sinaga would transform. He knew the city well, and he knew exactly where to find his victims. His routine was simple. After midnight, he would leave his apartment and venture into the bustling streets, where he would approach intoxicated men, offering them the promise of more drinks, a place to rest, or a chance to sober up. His charm, coupled with his polite and unassuming nature, made him the perfect predator. He was able to lure men back to his apartment with ease, where they would unknowingly fall into his trap. What made Sinaga's crime so insidious was not just the nature of his assaults, but the fact that he preyed on men who were vulnerable, men who had consumed large amounts of alcohol or were incapacitated in some other way. Sinaga's victims often had no recollection of what happened to them. They would wake up in his apartment confused and disoriented, assuming that they had simply drunk too much the night before. This lack of memory made it almost impossible for the victims to understand the gravity of what had occurred, and it kept Sinaga's crimes hidden for years. In Sinaga's world, he was both the hunter and the manipulator. He would drug his victims, making sure that they were unconscious before assaulting them. He filmed every act, capturing the helplessness of his victims for his own sick enjoyment. The videos became a testament to his crimes, a chilling record of his ability to manipulate and control his victims. Despite the increasing number of assaults, Sinaga's life continued without incident for years. His education, his life in the UK, and his public image all remained intact, but beneath the surface his darkness grew, and he continued his reign of terror, one that would eventually come to light in the most unexpected of ways. Reynhard Sinaga, despite his outward appearance as a model student, was a predator, a man whose charm and intelligence masked the horrifying reality of his actions. He was a man who hid his true self behind a facade of normalcy, a man who used his privilege and knowledge to exploit the very people who trusted him. It would take years for his crimes to be uncovered, and by then, he would have become the most prolific sexual offender in British history, leaving a legacy of pain and devastation in his wake. Reynhard Sinaga's method of operation was both chillingly calculated and deeply insidious, a combination that allowed him to evade detection for years while systematically violating his victims. His approach to targeting and assaulting men was a meticulous process, one that he honed over the course of his criminal career, which spanned from at least 2015 to 2017. What made Sinaga's methods particularly terrifying was the way he preyed upon vulnerable individuals, often intoxicated or disoriented, and the way he used their lack of awareness to execute his crimes without leaving behind any clear evidence of force. His actions were not impulsive, rather, they were the result of careful planning, manipulation, and a deep understanding of how to exploit the vulnerabilities of others. Sinaga's process began long before he encountered his victims in person. His apartment, located near Princess Street in Manchester, was the epicenter of his crimes. The apartment itself was unremarkable, modest, and typical of student housing, but it had an ideal location. Situated close to bars, clubs, and the Manchester gay village, it was in the heart of a bustling nightlife district, where young men, many of them intoxicated or vulnerable, would frequently wander. Yet, Sinaga knew that this was where he could find his targets, and he capitalized on it by keeping a constant watch on the streets outside his apartment. He was a regular presence in the area, and his familiarity with the surroundings gave him an edge in identifying potential victims. Sinaga had a keen sense of who to target. He sought out men who were alone, often those who had been drinking or were otherwise incapacitated. He knew that men in these states would be less aware of their surroundings and easier to manipulate. His preferred targets were often young, intoxicated men who had wandered away from their groups of friends or were walking alone in the late hours of the night. Sinaga would be alert to those who seemed vulnerable, often looking for signs that a person was too drunk to fend for themselves or that they were walking unsteadily. He knew how to spot someone who was in need of help and used this perception to get close to his prey. His technique was subtle and methodical. He would offer them assistance, whether it was a drink, a safe place to rest, or a friendly conversation to distract them from their discomfort. Once he had identified his victim, Sinaga's next move was to lure them back to his apartment. This step was critical in his method, and it was one he had perfected over time. Sinaga often used his charm and unassuming demeanor to convince his targets that he was simply a helpful stranger. His polite, calm, and respectable image made him seem trustworthy, and many victims found themselves believing that they were simply being offered a place to sleep off their intoxication. Sinaga knew how to make his offers sound casual and kind, presenting himself as someone who was just being generous or looking out for their well-being. This was where his intelligence and ability to read people came into play. He could gauge who would be receptive to his advances, and who might be more cautious. Once a victim agreed to follow him back to his apartment, Sinaga would carefully monitor their level of intoxication. His next step was to make sure they would lose consciousness, which was essential for him to carry out his assaults without resistance. To accomplish this, Sinaga would offer his victims a drink, one that was laced with a sedative or hallucinogenic. The drugs he used were potent and effective, ensuring that the victim would quickly become disoriented and unaware of their surroundings. Sinaga was a careful and cautious predator, and he took great care in making sure that his victims were fully under his control before proceeding with the assault. He would wait until they were visibly affected by the drugs, testing their responsiveness to ensure that they were sufficiently incapacitated. The next stage of Sinaga's operation involved the sexual assault itself. The victims, now unconscious or barely aware of their surroundings, were completely at his mercy. Sinaga would take advantage of their lack of awareness and record every moment of the assault, using his phone or other devices to film the acts. The videos would later be stored on his devices, each one a disturbing testament to the violations he had committed. He was meticulous in this regard, ensuring that the recordings captured the full extent of the assault. The act of filming his victims was not just about documenting the crime. It was a way for Sinaga to assert further control over them, reducing them to mere objects for his gratification. What set Sinaga apart from other offenders was his ability to remain undetected. His victims were often unaware of what had happened to them until they were contacted by the police. In the morning after the assault, Sinaga would inform his victims that they had passed out due to their heavy drinking, and that he had simply helped them get back to his apartment for safety. Many of his victims, still disoriented and embarrassed about their drunken behavior, believed his version of events and left without questioning anything. They would wake up in his apartment with no memory of the assault, attributing their grogginess and discomfort to the effects of alcohol. Sinaga had perfected the art of manipulation, convincing his victims that they had simply overindulged and that he had acted out of kindness. This psychological manipulation was a key aspect of his method. It allowed him to avoid detection and made it much harder for the victims to come forward or even understand that a crime had been committed. Over the course of more than 2 years, Sinaga's method remained consistent. He carefully selected his victims, manipulated them into his apartment, drugged them, and assaulted them while they were unconscious, filming the entire ordeal. The number of victims he violated was staggering, and it was only after the police uncovered his videos that the true extent of his crimes came to light. What made his method even more disturbing was his apparent lack of remorse. Sinaga's calm and calculated demeanor throughout his crimes suggested that he viewed his actions not as something to be ashamed of, but as an entitlement or a form of sport. The footage he recorded was not just evidence of his offenses, it was a reflection of his twisted mindset, one that saw other human beings as mere tools for his personal gratification. Sinaga's ability to evade detection for so long was a result of his careful planning, his understanding of human psychology, and his complete lack of empathy. He created a routine that allowed him to act with impunity, exploiting the trust of those around him and using their vulnerabilities to his advantage. His method was not just about physical control, but also about psychological manipulation, a fact that made his crimes all the more horrifying. Sinaga's ability to remain a hidden predator in plain sight for so long is a testament to the danger posed by individuals who are able to mask their true intentions with charm and intelligence. What began as a calculated method of assault would ultimately lead to one of the most shocking criminal cases in British history, a case that revealed the depths of human depravity and the devastating consequences of unchecked predation. It was in the early hours of June 2, 2017, when everything began to unravel. The discovery of the horrifying crimes that had gone undetected for years started with an incident that, on the surface, seemed like an unfortunate misunderstanding. 18-year-old Jerry, an amateur rugby league player from Manchester, had come home after a night out, his mind clouded by the alcohol he had consumed earlier. Like so many other young people in the city, he had gone out to enjoy the vibrant nightlife near Princess Street, where the clubs and bars thrived. But what was meant to be a simple night out turned into something that would alter his life forever. As the alcohol-induced haze of sleep began to lift, Jerry awoke to sharp pain across his body. He was disoriented, his head spinning, and for a moment he struggled to understand what was happening. His surroundings were unfamiliar. He wasn't in his own bed, and the room was dimly lit. The most disturbing thing, however, was the feeling of vulnerability that rushed through him. His pants were pulled down below his knees, and he was lying in an unfamiliar bed. As he turned his head, Jerry saw a stranger standing in front of him. Naked and engaged in a physical act that immediately triggered a flood of panic and anger in him. His body reacted instinctively. He was in a position where he could do little at first, but with the strength he had built through years of rugby training, he quickly pulled himself together. Jerry, tall and muscular, had always relied on his physicality, and now was no exception. Fueled by a deep sense of violation, Jerry fought back against the smaller man. His training and strength made short work of the man who had assaulted him. The attacker fell to the floor, battered and bruised, unable to continue. Jerry, still in shock and dealing with the overwhelming emotional and physical effects of what had happened to him, managed to collect himself enough to reach for his phone and call the police. It was only then, as he explained the situation to the officers, that the first of many misunderstandings began to unfold. When the police arrived at the scene, they found the two men in starkly contrasting conditions. Jerry, though shaken, appeared unharmed and healthy. The man on the floor, in stark contrast, was small, injured, and barely conscious. The officers, assessing the situation based on what they saw, naturally assumed that the smaller man was the victim. His injuries seemed more severe than Jerry's, and the fact that Jerry appeared unharmed led the police to question his side of the story. It seemed, at least at first, that Jerry had been the aggressor, and as a result he was taken into custody on suspicion of grievous bodily harm. The officers did not know then that this initial misunderstanding would eventually lead them to uncover the terrifying truth about what had been happening in the apartment near Princess Street for the past 2 years. While Jerry was being processed at the police station, the officers began to investigate the attacker. The man, later identified as Reynhard Sinaga, was taken to the hospital for treatment. There, his behavior raised more questions than answers. He was oddly calm and evasive, refusing to cooperate with the police or answer their questions. His refusal to unlock his phone was the first real clue that something more sinister was afoot. After the police pressured him, Sinaga finally unlocked his phone, but when they took a closer look at the device, what they found was far beyond anything they had anticipated. The phone was filled with videos, disturbing explicit footage that showed Sinaga in the act of sexually assaulting unconscious men. As the officers sifted through the material, it became horrifyingly clear that Jerry was not the only victim. There were hundreds of videos, each showing a different man, and many of the victims were identifiable in the footage. The men, seemingly unaware, were shown in various states of unconsciousness, drugged, and violated while they slept. Sinaga, the man who had appeared so calm in the face of his arrest, was revealed to be not a victim but the perpetrator, one of the most prolific serial offenders the United Kingdom had ever seen. It didn't take long for the police to connect the dots and realize that Jerry had, in fact, been one of the few individuals to wake up during the assault. For the first time, the officers understood the scope of what they were dealing with. Sinaga had been using his apartment as a hunting ground for years. His modus operandi was calculated and disturbing. He would lure men, often intoxicated, back to his home with promises of a safe place to rest or more drinks. Once there, he would drug them, ensuring that they were unconscious before assaulting them. He filmed every assault, creating a collection of videos that he kept hidden on his devices. Sinaga was a predator who operated with chilling efficiency, carefully documenting his actions as if they were a form of sick entertainment. In the aftermath of Jerry's discovery, the police began to sift through the staggering amount of evidence they had found. The number of victims was difficult to track at first, as many of them had no memory of the assaults. The footage from Sinaga's phone showed dozens of men, many of whom were still unidentified. The case quickly expanded beyond what anyone had anticipated. Investigators began to comb through old case files, seeking out reports from men who had gone missing or had woken up in strange places after nights out. They found that Sinaga's criminal activity stretched back to at least 2015, if not earlier, and that he had been operating undetected for more than 2 years. The discovery of Sinaga's crimes shocked the entire country. His outward appearance, his academic success, his friendly demeanor, his role in the local community had made him appear to be an upstanding individual. No one had suspected that the man living just a few steps away from Manchester's gay village, a popular area for both locals and tourists, could be capable of such horrors. The fact that Sinaga had been able to operate so openly for so long, without raising suspicion, left many wondering how he had managed to evade detection for so many years. For the victims, the discovery was both a relief and a nightmare. Many of them were contacted by the police after they were identified in the videos, and for most, the truth came as a shock. The men, many of whom had no memory of the assaults, were forced to confront the painful reality of what had been done to them. Some were reluctant to come forward, either because they were ashamed or because they were unable to process the trauma of what had happened. Others, like Jerry, were eager to see justice done, but they were all faced with the same gut-wrenching truth. They had been violated in the most intimate and brutal way, and the man responsible had been allowed to continue his crimes for years without consequence. The discovery of Sinaga's true nature marked the beginning of a lengthy investigation, one that would lead to his eventual arrest and conviction. But for those involved, the discovery was only the beginning of a long, painful process of coming to terms with the scale of his crimes. The police, the victims, and even the general public were left to grapple with the horrifying reality of how one man had managed to inflict so much pain on so many people, and how, despite his outward normalcy, he had been capable of such unfathomable evil. The investigation into Reynhard Sinaga's crimes was an immense and painstaking effort that spanned several years, involving numerous law enforcement agencies and experts. It began with the discovery of Sinaga's disturbing phone footage, captured during his sexual assaults, and the police were immediately confronted with the horrifying scale of his actions. As the videos of the assaults were examined, it became clear that the man who had seemed so innocuous to the public was responsible for a staggering number of crimes, each more appalling than the last. What began as a single case of assault quickly expanded into a much broader investigation, revealing a pattern of predation that had been concealed in plain sight for years. In the aftermath of the discovery, the Manchester Police Department took charge of the investigation, with a special team dedicated to combing through the vast amount of digital evidence found in Sinaga's possession. What had initially been a routine search for evidence related to a single crime soon became a sprawling investigation into the extent of his actions. The police worked tirelessly to catalog the hundreds of videos found on Sinaga's devices, and in the process, they uncovered the chilling truth. Sinaga had systematically drugged, assaulted, and filmed at least 159 men over a period of 2 years, most of whom had been unaware of what had happened to them until they were contacted by the authorities. The first challenge for investigators was to identify the victims in the videos. Sinaga, ever the meticulous planner, had carefully recorded his assaults, and many of the men in the footage appeared unconscious or immobilized, making it difficult for the police to distinguish who they were. Some of the men were easy to identify, but for others it was a painstaking process of cross-referencing with surveillance footage, witness accounts, and missing persons reports. The police pored over every frame of the footage, looking for any clue that could lead them to the victims. One of the first breakthroughs came when they identified Jerry, the rugby player who had fought back against Sinaga after waking up during an assault. Jerry's quick actions and subsequent police report had inadvertently led to the unraveling of Sinaga's crimes. His statement was pivotal in launching the investigation, as it provided the police with their first concrete piece of evidence that Sinaga was not just a random individual, but a calculated and dangerous predator. When Jerry's testimony was cross-referenced with the footage on Sinaga's phone, the pattern of Sinaga's predation became more apparent. But despite this early lead, the investigation faced enormous challenges. Many of the victims, like Jerry, had no memory of what had happened to them. They had woken up in Sinaga's apartment confused and disoriented, often with no idea of how they had gotten there. Some initially believed they had simply drunk too much the night before and had ended up in an unfamiliar place. Others dismissed their discomfort and confusion as a result of the after-effects of alcohol. It wasn't until the police reached out to them and showed them the footage that the full extent of the violation became clear. For many, the realization that they had been filmed while unconscious was as traumatic as the assault itself. The police worked with sensitivity, understanding the immense psychological toll this investigation was having on the victims. Some of them had to confront their own trauma head-on, watching themselves being violated in the videos, while others struggled with the idea of coming forward and reliving the nightmare. Many were reluctant to speak out for fear of the stigma associated with such an assault, particularly within the gay community. Sinaga had preyed on men in a city known for its open-mindedness, and the victims, many of whom had been intoxicated and vulnerable, now found themselves thrust into a legal battle they had never asked for. As the investigation progressed, the police began to piece together the details of Sinaga's method of operation. He had lived in an apartment located just a short distance from Manchester's gay village, an area known for its bars and clubs, which likely made it an ideal location for his predatory activities. Sinaga, who was openly gay, used his knowledge of the area and his charm to lure his victims. His approach was disarmingly smooth. He would find intoxicated men on the streets or in nearby bars, offering them a safe place to sober up or suggesting that they continue their night of drinking at his apartment. Many of the victims, disoriented by alcohol or simply eager to find a place to relax, agreed to go with him. Once at his apartment, Sinaga would offer them a drink, which was always spiked with a powerful hallucinogenic substance that would render the men unconscious. He took extra care to make sure the drugs were effective, often testing his victims to ensure they were fully incapacitated before proceeding. The assault was then filmed, with Sinaga's phone capturing every horrific moment. When the victims woke up, they often had no memory of what had happened, their bodies feeling sore and their surroundings unfamiliar. Sinaga, ever the manipulator, would calmly explain that they had simply passed out from drinking too much and had been taken care of in his apartment. Most victims, still groggy and confused, left without suspecting anything sinister had occurred. What was most disturbing about the investigation was how Sinaga had managed to maintain such a facade of normalcy for so long. He was a doctoral student, well-educated and well-spoken, with a promising future ahead of him. He had blended seamlessly into society, and his victims had no reason to suspect that the man they encountered in the clubs and bars was capable of such horrific acts. Sinaga had gone to great lengths to hide his true nature, carefully curating his public persona to appear harmless. He had been able to keep his predation a secret, all the while living in close proximity to his prey. As the police uncovered more and more footage, the scope of Sinaga's crimes became increasingly apparent. The videos were chilling, not only because of the violence they depicted, but because of the complete lack of remorse Sinaga displayed. He showed no empathy for his victims, and in many instances, he even seemed to take pleasure in the power he held over them. Investigators watched in disbelief as Sinaga smiled at the camera, completely unfazed by the suffering he was causing. The investigation took months, and as the police continued to identify more victims, they were faced with the daunting task of contacting each one and bringing them in for questioning. Many victims, unaware they had even been assaulted, were shocked to learn the truth. Others, too traumatized to engage in the investigation, chose not to participate. The authorities understood the emotional toll this took on the survivors, and worked to ensure they were supported throughout the process. Despite the hurdles, however, the evidence mounted, and the case against Sinaga grew stronger with each passing day. By the time the investigation was nearing its conclusion, the full extent of Sinaga's crimes had become clear. He had assaulted at least 159 men, and the police were certain that there were many more victims whose identities had yet to be discovered. The video footage, alongside the testimonies of the survivors, painted a damning picture of a man who had spent years exploiting and violating his fellow human beings without remorse or fear of getting caught. What began as a single assault quickly spiraled into one of the most shocking and disturbing criminal investigations the UK had ever seen. And it was clear that the investigation was just the beginning of a long legal battle to bring Sinaga to justice. The trial of Reynhard Sinaga was a momentous and harrowing event, one that exposed the deep scars of his victims while simultaneously revealing the chilling defiance of the man who had perpetrated their trauma. It was an experience that left the survivors of his assaults emotionally drained, as they relived the horrors that had been inflicted upon them. For many, the courtroom became a place of both confrontation and catharsis, while for Sinaga, it was an arena in which he continued to display his unsettling sense of control and indifference. When Sinaga stood trial, he was confronted with an overwhelming weight of evidence that painted him as a ruthless predator, someone who had used his intelligence and charm to lure his victims, drug them, and film their assault. The prosecution's case was built on a mountain of incriminating video footage, which showed Sinaga's methodical approach to his crimes. Each video, meticulously recorded by Sinaga, was a testament to the cold, calculated nature of his actions. His victims, many of whom had no memory of the events, were now forced to watch themselves in the most intimate and degrading of circumstances, captured without their consent or knowledge. For the victims, the trial was a terrifying prospect. Many had only learned about the extent of Sinaga's actions after the police contacted them, often showing them the videos where they had been filmed while unconscious. Some of them had been led to believe that they had simply passed out after drinking too much, while others had chalked up the disorientation and discomfort to the after effects of a wild night out. The truth, however, was far more sinister. Sinaga's actions had violated their most basic sense of security, and for many, watching the footage of themselves in such vulnerable, helpless states was a painful reminder of just how deeply they had been wronged. As the trial unfolded, one by one the victims took to the stand, each one sharing their personal experiences of the night they had encountered Sinaga. Some of them spoke of their confusion and fear when they woke up in his apartment, uncertain of how they had ended up there. Others described the crushing feeling of betrayal, knowing that they had been drugged and filmed without their knowledge. Some men had initially dismissed their discomfort, attributing it to a night of excessive drinking. But when the police came forward with the evidence, the full horror of what had transpired became clear. For many of the victims, speaking in court was a deeply emotional experience. The courtroom, usually a place for the delivery of justice, became a place for healing and reflection. Victims who had been isolated in their trauma now stood together in solidarity, their voices a defiant cry against the abuse they had suffered. While some chose to speak directly to Sinaga, others found it more difficult to confront him, but all of them were united in the knowledge that they had been wronged, and that the man responsible for their pain was finally going to be held accountable. Reynhard Sinaga's response to the trial was a study in cold defiance. He remained remarkably composed throughout the proceedings, his demeanor unwavering despite the mounting evidence against him. As the testimonies were read aloud, he did not flinch. There was no visible sign of remorse, no regret for the devastation he had caused. Instead, he sat there, almost detached from the proceedings, as if the entire trial was nothing more than an inconvenient disruption in his life. His silence spoke volumes, a chilling contrast to the emotional turmoil that gripped the victims in the courtroom. Sinaga's cold defiance was, in many ways, more unsettling than his crimes themselves. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he remained unrepentant, showing no hint of empathy for those whose lives he had destroyed. The defense, aware of the gravity of the charges against Sinaga, argued that the victims had willingly participated in the sexual encounters. However, the overwhelming body of evidence contradicted this claim. Sinaga had drugged his victims, rendering them unconscious and completely unaware of the abuse being perpetrated upon them. His use of powerful sedatives to incapacitate his victims was a crucial part of the prosecution's case, as it demonstrated not only the violation of consent, but the premeditated and methodical nature of his actions. The fact that he had filmed the assaults further demonstrated his intent to control and dominate his victims, turning them into nothing more than objects in his personal collection of videos. As the trial continued, the victims found themselves increasingly disillusioned by the legal process. Though they knew it was a necessary step in seeking justice, the court proceedings were often grueling and emotionally exhausting. The defense's strategy, which sought to minimize Sinaga's culpability by casting doubt on the victims' accounts, was difficult for many to endure. To hear their experiences questioned, to have their trauma dissected and minimized, was a painful reminder of how deeply society often fails to understand or believe victims of sexual violence. For some, it felt as though they were being re-traumatized by the very system that was meant to protect them. Despite these emotional challenges, the prosecution remained determined to hold Sinaga accountable for his actions. The case against him was solid, bolstered by the extensive footage found on his devices, the testimonies of the victims, and the overwhelming evidence of premeditation. It became clear that Sinaga had meticulously planned each of his assaults, targeting vulnerable men who were intoxicated or in a weakened state. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy, while simultaneously leading such a double life, was what made the case even more disturbing. It revealed the darkness that could exist beneath the surface of someone who outwardly seemed harmless and unassuming. The trial's culmination brought a sense of justice for the victims, but it also left them with a deep sense of sadness and anger. The conviction of Reynhard Sinaga, while satisfying, could never undo the damage that had been done. No amount of legal punishment could erase the psychological scars he had left behind. For the victims, the trial was not just about obtaining justice, but about reclaiming their sense of power and agency. It was an opportunity to be heard, to take back control over a situation in which they had been utterly powerless. In the end, the trial of Reynhard Sinaga was a sobering reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a seemingly innocent face. His cold defiance in the courtroom, coupled with the devastating testimonies of his victims, painted a picture of a man who had shown no regard for human life or dignity. The trial exposed the immense emotional toll that sexual violence takes on its victims, not just in the moments of the assault itself, but in the long-lasting aftermath that can last a lifetime. As the judge delivered the verdict, sentencing Sinaga to life in prison, there was a collective sense of closure in the courtroom. But for the victims, the healing was just beginning. The trial had been a necessary step, but the road to recovery would be long and fraught with emotional and psychological challenges. Yet, despite the pain and trauma they had endured, many of the victims found strength in their shared experience and in the knowledge that Sinaga's reign of terror had come to an end. The trial had been a painful yet crucial chapter in their journey toward healing, and as they left the courtroom, they began the difficult but necessary process of reclaiming their lives. The aftermath of Reynhard Sinaga's trial was a complex and painful chapter not just for his victims but for everyone connected to the case, from the investigators to the wider public. The reverberations of his crimes rippled through the lives of those he had harmed, leaving behind a landscape of emotional wreckage and fractured trust. For the victims, the aftermath was a journey of conflicting emotions: relief that justice had been served, yet a deep, lingering sorrow and trauma that no legal process could ever erase. For the families and friends of the victims, it was a painful awakening to the reality of the horror that had been lurking in plain sight. And for Sinaga himself, his conviction, though inevitable, marked the start of his own descent into a life of isolation, stripped of the power and control he had so ruthlessly exerted. The survivors of Sinaga's attacks were left to rebuild their lives in the wake of the trial. They had courageously stepped into the light, sharing their stories of unimaginable abuse and violation, and in doing so they had exposed a darkness that many of them had lived in silence. But even with the conviction and the knowledge that Sinaga would spend the rest of his life in prison, many of the victims found that healing was a far more elusive concept than they had anticipated. In the last chapter, Professor Downey has left us with this quote: "From the families of Sinaga, the loss of their children, the psychological toll of being drugged, assaulted, and filmed without consent had left deep, invisible scars. For some, even the act of walking into a public place, once a simple and mundane task, had become an exercise in anxiety and dread. Trust in others had been shattered, replaced by a pervasive sense of fear and hypervigilance. Many victims found themselves experiencing a kind of emotional numbness, an inability to connect to others, or a sudden surge of anger and confusion. The trauma had carved deep trenches in their psyches, and while the trial had provided a sense of justice, it had also unearthed emotions and memories that had been buried for far too long. The shame and isolation that many victims felt was compounded by the public nature of the case. As the trial gained media attention, the world became privy to the most intimate and painful details of their lives. Their trauma was no longer private, it had been put on display, dissected and analyzed in the media. Some victims struggled with feelings of guilt or confusion, questioning whether they had somehow brought the abuse upon themselves, even though the evidence was irrefutable. The fact that they had been drugged, assaulted, and filmed against their will was clear, yet the sheer violation of personal autonomy had created a psychological disconnect that made many of them doubt their own perceptions. Many victims had to seek therapy or counseling to help them navigate the overwhelming flood of emotions that had resurfaced during and after the trial. For some, this was the beginning of a long and difficult healing process, while for others, the journey felt insurmountable. The wider public also struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of Sinaga's crimes. In the months that followed the conviction, there was a collective reckoning with how such atrocities could have been allowed to happen for so long. How had a man, who appeared so unassuming, been able to operate undetected for years? His ability to deceive so many people, even convincing them that they had consented to sexual acts when they had been rendered unconscious, revealed a chilling vulnerability in the way society viewed trust and consent. For some, the case became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked privilege and the predatory behaviors that can hide behind a respectable facade. It sparked conversations about how much was known about sexual violence and how frequently it goes unnoticed or underreported. Some also pointed to the lack of awareness surrounding the use of date rape drugs and how easily they could be slipped into drinks without the victim's knowledge. The case prompted calls for better education and stronger protections for those who might be at risk. People began asking why it had taken so long for the full extent of Sinaga's crimes to come to light, and why his behavior had not been flagged earlier. The police had discovered the scale of Sinaga's actions after investigating a single assault, but it was revealed that Sinaga had been operating with impunity for years, with no suspicion raised among those who knew him. The lack of awareness about sexual violence in certain social circles had allowed Sinaga to prey upon vulnerable young men, often targeting them in nightclubs and bars, where alcohol and party culture created the perfect conditions for him to strike. It was a sobering realization that, in a society so focused on appearing safe, the most dangerous predators often went unnoticed, their actions slipping under the radar until it was too late. For Sinaga, the aftermath was a solitary and unyielding existence. Despite his cold defiance in court, the reality of his life post-conviction was a stark contrast to the manipulation and power he had once wielded. He was sentenced to life in prison, and the weight of his actions followed him into his cell. Once a man who had meticulously planned and executed his horrific crimes, Sinaga now found himself in a prison where the structure, rules, and harsh conditions stripped away the carefully constructed persona he had once maintained. The network of power he had cultivated through his charm, his education, and his ability to deceive all vanished. He was just another prisoner, a man who had been exposed for the monster he truly was. But even in the confines of prison, Sinaga's behavior continued to raise eyebrows. His sense of entitlement and lack of remorse persisted, even as he was confronted with the reality of his isolation. Prison life, for someone like him, could be brutal, especially considering the nature of his crimes. There were reports that Sinaga was placed under protective custody, given the likely risk to his safety and the general population. The very acts he had carried out in the outside world, his manipulation, his use of power, were now turned against him in a context where physical retribution was common. Yet, in the absence of a wider audience, Sinaga had no platform to continue his calculated control. His life, reduced to a solitary confinement within the prison system, became a mute testament to the fact that even the most calculated and manipulative predator could ultimately be contained by the walls of justice. The broader societal reaction to Sinaga's crimes continued to evolve in the aftermath. As the case became more widely known, conversations around sexual violence, consent, and the importance of taking survivors seriously grew louder. People began to reflect on the structures of power that allowed such predation to occur unchecked for so long. Social media became a space for people to share their own experiences and to support those who had been harmed. Discussions around consent, especially around the use of drugs to incapacitate individuals, grew more widespread. Sinaga's case had opened a Pandora's box that many had been unwilling to confront for far too long. The shadows that had concealed his actions for years were now gone, and in their place the light of truth began to shine on the broader issues of sexual violence that Sinaga's crimes had brought to the forefront. In the end, the aftermath of Reynhard Sinaga's conviction was not only a reflection of the profound trauma and suffering he caused, but also a testament to the resilience of his victims and the potential for change within society. Their pain, though devastating, sparked conversations that could prevent future tragedies. For many, the aftermath was a painful but necessary reckoning, a realization that justice, though hard-won, was still only the beginning of the long road toward healing and understanding. The victims, having faced their tormentor in court, now had to face themselves, learning to rebuild their lives and their sense of trust in a world that had let them down. Sinaga's punishment, though severe, could never fully undo the damage, but in its own way it marked the first step toward acknowledging the horror of what had transpired.